Today I think I'll compare Portuguese with a special dialect of Portuguese called Spanish. Hello everyone, welcome to the Lang Focus channel and my name is Paul. Today's topic is how similar are Spanish and Portuguese? As you probably know, Spanish and Portuguese are both Ibero-Romance languages that share a common origin. They're different enough that they are definitely considered different languages, but they're also closely related and quite similar in many ways. On paper, the two languages look very similar, and speakers of either language can generally read the other language without too much trouble. The spoken languages, however, are more different from each other and less mutually intelligible than the written forms. And Portuguese speakers typically understand spoken Spanish better than Spanish speakers understand Portuguese.
Yeah, that's because Portuguese speakers are smart.
Well, actually, it's mostly because of the difference in pronunciation between the two languages, but we'll get into that a little later. Spanish and Portuguese share about 89% lexical similarity, meaning that 89% of the words have a cognate, or an equivalent, in the other language. Now that doesn't always mean that 89% of the words will be the same, because some of the different words are very basic and common words. And even though cognate words often look and sound quite similar, there are other cognates that have developed quite differently and now sound and look quite different. For instance, this pair of cognates clearly resemble each other. In Spanish,
mundo,
and in Portuguese,
mundo.
And these words mean earth or world. Now here's a less obvious pair of cognates. In Spanish,
pescado,
and in Portuguese,
peixe.
These words mean fish. So you can see the connection, but it's not quite so obvious. Personal pronouns. The personal pronouns in the two languages are generally similar, but with slightly different forms. For example,
yo, eu, nosotros.
Nós.
But also, the formal way of saying you is normally different. In Spanish, it's
usted.
In Portuguese, there's a word
Você.
But instead, people generally say
O senhor.
And,
A senhora.
which is like saying sir or madam. These are equivalents of
Señor,
and
señora.
in Spanish. But in Spanish, they're not used as pronouns. False friends. You will constantly encounter cognates in Spanish and Portuguese, but you'll also encounter lots of false friends, words that look and sound the same and might share a common origin, but their meaning is actually different. And some of these could potentially cause some crazy misunderstandings. The Spanish word
Pelado,
means bald, as in a shaved head. The Portuguese word
pelado,
means skinned or without skin. But in Brazilian Portuguese, it actually means naked. Hello, Mr. Hairstylist, I'd like to get naked, please. In Portuguese, the word for octopus is
polvo,
in Spanish, the word for octopus is
pulpo,
and
polvo,
means dust, but it also means something sexual. And kids, don't Google it. In Spanish,
una cena exquisita,
means a delicious dinner. In Portuguese,
Uma cena esquisita.
means a weird scene.
propina,
In Spanish, means tip, like a tip for a waiter.
Propina.
Means tuition fees, like for university. And in Brazilian Portuguese, it means bribe. In Spanish,
barata,
is an adjective meaning cheap. In Portuguese,
Barata.
is a noun meaning cockroach. So even though lots of words are pretty much the same in either language, it might be a little dangerous to assume that they mean the same thing. Pronunciation. The main reason that the spoken forms of the two languages are less intelligible than the written forms is because they differ significantly in phonology. Portuguese has much more complex phonology than Spanish, with many extra sounds. And this is one reason that Portuguese speakers have an easier time understanding spoken Spanish than vice versa. Consonants. In Spanish, the B, D, and G consonants have soft pronunciations that occur, for example, between vowels. Portuguese doesn't have these soft consonants. For example, in Spanish,
nada,
in Portuguese,
Nada.
in Spanish,
saber,
in Portuguese.
saber,
Next, the trilled R sound of Spanish, which occurs at the beginning of words or between vowels, or at the end of a word, corresponds to a rather different sound in Portuguese. In Spanish,
rápido,
in Portuguese,
rápido,
in Spanish,
torre,
in Portuguese.
Torre.
Next, the sound represented by a double L in Spanish has a corresponding sound in Portuguese, represented by LH. For example, in Spanish there's
fallar,
and in Portuguese there's
falhar,
meaning fail. And Portuguese has some consonants that don't have an equivalent in Spanish. First, a sh sound, spelled with ch or with x. So in Spanish we have,
Llega.
but in Portuguese,
Chega.
meaning arrives. A j sound. In Spanish we have,
Agencia.
and in Portuguese we have.
Agência.
Next, a v sound. Spanish doesn't really have a v sound. It does have the soft b, which kind of sounds similar to a v, but Portuguese has a distinct v sound. So in Spanish we have,
Visitar.
and in Portuguese we have.
Visitar.
In Spanish we have,
Libro.
and in Portuguese we have,
Livro.
and one more, a z sound. So in Spanish we have,
Preciso.
and in Portuguese we have.
Preciso.
This sound is often found between vowels and at the beginning of words. Vowels. There are quite a few more vowel sounds in Portuguese than there are in Spanish. Spanish has 5 pure vowels, while Portuguese has all of those plus 7 additional ones. Spanish has just one E sound, which sounds like A. Portuguese has this, and an additional one like the E in set. In Portuguese, it's difficult to predict which one to use in any given word. These ones are different. In Spanish,
Mero.
in Portuguese,
Mero.
but these ones are the same. In Spanish,
Mesa.
and in Portuguese,
Mesa.
when a word has the diphthong ye in Spanish, it usually corresponds to an open E in Portuguese. For example, in Spanish,
Siete.
and in Portuguese,
Sete.
Spanish also has just one O sound, like in the word go, but shorter. But Portuguese has an additional open O, which sounds like the O in pot. In Spanish,
Obvio.
in Portuguese,
Óbvio.
and sometimes the diphthong ue in Spanish corresponds to the open E in Portuguese. So in Spanish we have,
Escuela.
and in Portuguese we have.
Escola.
Now these might not seem like major differences so far, but there are lots of differences like that. Reduced vowels. Vowels in Spanish are quite clearly pronounced in their full form, but vowels in Portuguese often become reduced, especially when they are unstressed at the end of a word. So in Spanish we have,
Casa.
but in Portuguese we have.
Casa.
In Spanish we have,
Libro.
and in Portuguese we have.
Livro.
In Spanish we have,
Abre.
which means it opens. And in Portuguese we have.
Abre.
Nasal vowels. Portuguese also has 5 nasal vowels that don't occur in Spanish. A nasal vowel means that some air is released through your nose, which creates a distinct sound. Vowels become nasalized when they are followed by a nasal consonant, an M or an N. In Spanish,
Cantar.
and in Portuguese,
Cantar.
in Spanish,
Insulto.
and in Portuguese.
Insulto.
This also happens when there's a tilde over a vowel, like in this Portuguese word,
Irmã.
meaning sister. Because of the extra vowels in Portuguese, there are also more diphthongs, meaning 2 vowels that blend together in one syllable. This includes some nasal diphthongs. For example, in Spanish we have,
Sección.
but in Portuguese it's.
Seção.
In Spanish we have,
Limones.
and in Portuguese.
Limões.
Little differences like these add up to make Portuguese and Spanish sound rather different. Grammar. Spanish and Portuguese grammar are generally very similar, but they do have numerous differences as well. Gender. Both languages basically have 2 genders, masculine and feminine. But sometimes the gender of cognate words is different. For example, words in Spanish ending with
Aje.
are masculine, and their equivalents in Portuguese ending in
Agem.
are feminine. So in Spanish we have,
El viaje.
which is masculine, but in Portuguese we have,
A viagem.
which is feminine. Both languages have 4 definite articles for the 2 genders in singular and plural. But notice that Spanish also has the neuter singular definite article.
Lo.
It's not used with nouns, but with adjectives or possessive pronouns in order to use them like nouns. For example,
Lo importante es amar.
which means the important thing is love. In Portuguese it would be,
O importante é o amor.
with o being the masculine singular definite article. Verbs. The way verb tenses work in the 2 languages is very similar. Almost all verb tenses have an exact equivalent in the other language, just with slightly different conjugations. So in Spanish we have,
Nosotros comemos pescado.
which means we eat fish. And in Portuguese that would be,
Nós comemos peixe.
so the present tense form is the same. And next a past tense sentence. In Spanish,
Ellos comieron pescado.
they ate fish. And in Portuguese,
Eles comeram peixe.
in this case the conjugations aren't exactly the same, but they are equivalent. Now a future sentence. In Spanish,
Yo comeré pescado.
which means I will eat fish. And in Portuguese, it's...
Eu comerei peixe.
These verb forms are similar, but with a different vowel sound at the end of the word. One difference in the verb system is that the perfect tense is formed with a different auxiliary verb. Spanish uses
Haber.
as the auxiliary verb, which means something like to be, but as an auxiliary verb we can translate it as have. Portuguese has a verb,
Haver,
but instead the verb
ter,
is used as the auxiliary verb, which means to have. In Spanish we have,
Yo he leído el libro.
which means I have read the book. And in Portuguese we have,
Eu tenho lido o livro.
which means I have been reading the book. So notice that the auxiliary verbs are different. And notice that the past participle of the verb meaning read is almost the same. But more importantly, note that this type of sentence means something different in either language. In Spanish it means I have read the book. In Portuguese it means I have been reading the book. In other words, the past action is still continuing. In order to say I have read the book in Portuguese, you would use the preiterite tense instead, like this.
eu li o livro.
I believe that Latin American Spanish is more like Portuguese in this regard. And that difference is only in the present perfect. The past perfect doesn't have that kind of difference. So if we want to express they had read the book, in Spanish we would say,
Habían leído el libro.
and in Portuguese we would say,
Eles tinham lido o livro.
the main difference between these two is just the auxiliary verb. Word order. The word order is generally quite similar between the two languages, as you've probably noticed already, but there are some differences too. In open questions, the subject goes after the verb in Spanish.
¿Dónde está Pablo?
In Portuguese, it normally comes before the verb,
Onde Pablo está?
but it could also be
Onde está Pablo?
in yes or no questions. In Spanish, the actor can come either before or after the verb, like this,
¿Habla ella inglés?
or,
¿Ella habla inglés?
but in Portuguese, it must come before the verb, like this.
Ela fala inglês?
The placement of object pronouns. In Spanish, the object pronoun normally comes before the verb. For example,
Él me ayudó.
which means he helped me. In Portuguese, it comes after the verb, like this.
Ele ajudou-me?
Another example, in Spanish,
¿Me vas a ayudar o qué?
which means, are you going to help me or what? And in Portuguese,
Vais-me ajudar ou quê?
so those are some of the main differences between the two languages. Let's look at one more sentence and see what we find. These mean, very few countries in the world take pride in having so many different styles of music and dance. In Spanish,
Muy pocos países en el mundo se enorgullecen de tener tantos estilos diferentes de música y baile.
word for word, it's very few countries in the world, reflexive pronoun, are proud, and that's a verb, of having so many styles different of music and dance. And then there's the Portuguese sentence.
Pouquíssimos países no mundo estão orgulhosos de terem tantos estilos diferentes de música e dança.
Word for word, very few countries in the world are, and that's a copula verb, proud, and that's an adjective, of having so many styles different of music and dance. Again, these sentences are similar, but there are a few differences. The way of expressing very few is different.
Pouquíssimos.
In Portuguese is the formal way to say very few. In informal Portuguese, though, it's possible to say
Muito poucos?
which is a cognate with the Spanish phrase. Next, notice that in Portuguese, the preposition and definite article contract together into one word, while in Spanish, they're separate words. Next, these words here are not cognates. The Spanish word is a reflexive pronoun, because the next word is a verb meaning to be proud. In Portuguese, it's the copula verb, followed by an adjective meaning proud. These two words have the same root, but one is a verb and the other is an adjective. Next, the words here after the preposition are a bit different. The Spanish word is an infinitive form, while the Portuguese is a personal infinitive. The infinitive by itself is
Ter.
and also notice that the word for dance is different. But also notice that it sounds like the English word ballet.
Baile.
So as you can see, Spanish and Portuguese are indeed sister languages that have a lot in common. They do have a lot of little differences that altogether make them distinct languages, but knowing either language would definitely help you learn the other one relatively quickly. So the question of the day, for speakers of either Spanish or Portuguese who have studied the other language, did you find it easy to learn? What was easy and what was challenging? Also, feel free to share other examples of their similarities and differences in the comments down below. Be sure to subscribe to this channel and also check out Lang Focus on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And a big special thanks to all of my Patreon supporters, especially these magnificent people right here on the screen, for their monthly pledges. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.